This fall season, we are living in the book of 1 Peter in the New Testament. We're living there because we are actually living it. Peter talks about the twofold identity of his readers, which is what? First of all, we're God's elect, and we're exiles. Next slide, please. Elect, exiles, scattered throughout all of Asia Minor, which has become the Roman Empire, which is, at the end of the book, the new Babylon. If we claim to follow Jesus, this is our life. And not just sort of vicariously or metaphorically. As followers of Jesus, he says we have this same twofold identity as Peter's original readers, a dual identity that creates this tension. Elect, chosen by God, and yet scattered in exile. Literally, the phrase there means exiles of the dispersion, the diaspora. Temporary residents living in a place that is no longer their real homeland. A status God's people in their before Jesus period spent a lot of time in. Beginning with the father of their nation, Abraham, right? Exiles is sometimes translated with that older word called sojourners. I love that word, sojourners. Temporary residents in a land that's not really home. Abraham sojourned, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9. Abraham sojourned in a place he would later call home. He was never really at home there. Home, but not really home. We're not there yet. We're still sojourning together, but we are in. Another way to describe this identity we have as chosen ones is that we are saints. That really is the status that we have. Saints, which means simply set apart by God, for God. Saint is a variation of that word, translated from the same word as holy, set apart. And the word sanctify, which is the process of setting apart, which Peter uses these words a lot in the book, right? How did Jesus describe this twofold identity? He said we are in the world, but not of the world, right? It's the same thing. Chosen, exiles, saints, sojourners. That's actually what I was going to call this series, Saints and Sojourners, but I got voted down. There's only two of us voting, and I got voted down, so figure that one out. It's called marriage. We are saints as we sojourn, and we can live as sojourners well because we are saints. Next slide. Invested, but not too invested. We live here, but we are no longer from here. That is our life. And when is the time of the year that we wrestle with that most? At least I have. It's at Christmas. We want to go home, but we can't. We want everyone home, but it's not happening. And even when we do, home is not what we had always dreamed it would be, right? Christmas is the most important time of the year to think about and to hear the call of Jesus. Welcome home, in spite of the fact that you're not yet home. So how do we live that life well? Well, that's what Peter's writing to help us with. We're in that section in the middle of the book, chapters 2 and 3, where he's talking about these very real world of the streets kind of challenges, difficult, abusive work environments, anti-Christian government environments, difficult marriage. And then at chapter 3, verse 8, beginning to talk about relationships in general. In chapters 3 and 4, as he continues on this practical level, he introduces us to an essential perspective for sojourning well as saints. And we're going to front load our teaching by talking a bit about that perspective so we can see it in the text as we read it. A number of years ago, some of us are of the generation that ate up Stephen Covey's book, best-selling book, called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Some of you remember that book. Habit number 1 is be proactive. Today we might say, own it, right? What he meant by that was that we need to be alert to not just reacting, but to taking the responsibility and the initiative to act positively to everything, to seek to improve everything. Be proactive. As you hear that, if you've been engaged in our teaching from the book of Peter, you might just be thinking of where we ended up last week, right? The being proactive in working at unity, sympathy, love, compassion, and humility. Those are the kinds of things that Covey was talking about in being proactive. And just like the last 2 weeks, we're going to overlap with that a bit this week in our teaching. But as we come to the heart of our teaching today, you'd think Covey was actually reading Peter's letter. And maybe he was, actually. Because what's habit number 2? The habit that helps us stay alert, ready, and motive to be proactive well? Begin with the end in mind. If you've had any experience in project management or working on a project team, you know that after you determine who you're accountable to for the project, before you start the project plan, you got to ask the question, how will we know when we've won? How will we know when we're done? What will the finished product have to do and be? In other words, begin with the end in mind. We live in a world of wants, a world in which the dominant message is live your desires. And the question we're asked is, well, what do you want? And the advice we're given is just live that, right? But we don't often enough ask the more important question, where do I want to end up? What do I want to achieve? What's the end result I want to aim for? As someone once said, you not only have to want what you want, you have to want what your wants lead to. How will this play out really? Not in my fantasies, but in reality. And ultimately, how will this look when I stand before God? In our teaching from 1 Peter today, beginning in chapter 3, verse 8, Peter talks about some of the key ways that we need to, that we actually get to live with the end in mind, to begin every day, enter and respond to every situation with the end in mind. And at the end of every day, to evaluate our responses to every situation by asking the question, was I really living with the end in mind? So let's read it. 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning at verse 8. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil. He's quoting from Psalm 34 here. And their lips from deceitful speech. In other words, he's saying, you guys know this already. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who's going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, revere or set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Because it is better, if it's God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Because Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. And being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. Let's just skip down to 4 verse 7, where this section really ends. We're not going to go all the way today, but the end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and sober mind so that you may pray. So as we read, how many times did you see that Peter talked about the end we have in mind, beginning with the end in mind? Did you see it? In verse 9, it says, we are called to inherit a blessing. Next slide. Verse 10, next slide. He said, so that you may see good days. Verse 15, he talks about the hope you possess. Verse 18, he talks about Jesus dying so he could bring us to God, deliver us to God, in the end, pure and perfect. Jesus' goal is to deliver us into God's presence secure and whole. Chapter 4, verse 5, he talks about it again. They will face a reckoning on that day. And then verse 7, we saw it. He wraps it up as he transitions into the next section. The end of all things is at hand. Not necessarily near time-wise, but it's ready to be there. It's pretty clear that what's in Peter's mind in this whole section is living with the end in mind, right? So let's focus just for a few minutes on the verse that I think is the peak verse in this passage. In Peter's style of writing, what everything in this section moves toward and then moves from is the verse that, as we read this passage, many of us said, oh yeah, I know that one, I've heard that one. We may even have memorized it, and we should. It's a central statement in this book and in the New Testament. Verse 15, but set apart Christ as Lord in your heart. Not my feelings in the center, not my desires, not me as CEO. Set apart Christ as CEO in your hearts, the control center of your being. The most common way to live today, and the way we celebrate Christmas in our world exposes this, by the way. Who is Lord in my heart? It's me. Who is Jesus? Santa. Right? I know what I want, I know what I need, and Jesus is the one whose job is to deliver that to me. And I'll leave him a cookie or two as a tip. Set apart Christ as Lord in your heart. Not only because he is the Lord of the universe, but because in his death, he bought me back. And so literally, if he bought me, he owns me. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing because I set him apart. As I set him apart as Lord, I'm really rescuing myself from myself and my wacko plans, my distorted ideas, my self-limiting behaviors. Set apart Christ as Lord because he has set you apart as a chosen one. And if I don't, the tension I feel is even going to be worse. Set apart Christ as Lord and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks about the hope you possess. Now, we have often heard that verse quoted as the foundation for what we call apologetics, right? Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks about the reason for the hope that you possess. Now, apologetics, defending the Christian faith through logical and philosophical and scientific validations for believing. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I've often been bolstered in my own faith through some good apologetics, but I get queasy when this verse is quoted as the basis for debates and arguments and proofs. That's not what it's talking about. It's not talking about apologetics in that way. We'll see what it's really saying and why it's central when we come to this passage, but for now, let's just get from it the core, beginning with the end in mind question. And that is this: am I living in my hope story? Or am I living in and from my hurt story? Hurts of the past or fear of being hurt in the future? What it is saying is that one result of setting Christ apart as Lord in my heart, obeying Him and not following my feelings, following Him as the truth and not whatever my peers or my culture says is true, one result is that others will see I'm living a story of hope. A hope that is yet to come but is totally secure. They will see that you are allowing that hope to be, Hebrews 11 verse 6, the anchor for your soul. Allowing that hope to pull you forward. It's firm and secure. What it's talking about here is the apologetic of a hope-filled life. A life that lives with the end in mind. You see, here's the deal. In our exile or sojourner life, hurt is often the dominant thing we experience and that we give. But as those who are chosen ones living from the end, hurt is not our story. Hope is our story. So what will living from my hope story and not my hurt story look like? Well, there's a lot in this section. But as I've read and reread it many, many times, I think there are 4 basic things Peter tells us here about what it means to live every day, beginning with the end in mind. Live every day in and into my story of hope. As you know by now, it's hard to sort of outline this letter into clear, definitive points. There's always overlap in what Peter says. So my own take on his flow of thought is that in chapter 3, verse 8, look at it in your Bible, when he starts moving from the specific areas of difficult government relations or anti-Christian government attitude, difficult work environments, challenging marriage environments, when he begins in verse 8 to talk about relationships in general, he's actually fleshing out in a summary kind of way what we should be known for in every one of those other 3. In other words, when he says, finally, he's not saying this is my last point. It means something like this. Let me wrap it up with some clear, specific behaviors that I'm talking about. And at the same time, he's moving toward the next section as he talks about living with the end in mind. I say that because his first clear reference with living with the end in mind is verse 9, right? Thinking about and living into our inheritance of blessing, which is already ours, but not yet our full experience. So, he's beginning that thinking about living with the end in mind. What we get in verse 8 is that the first thing it will look like to live with the end in mind, to live in my hope story and my hurt story, is that I will be seen as someone who is building others. Next slide, please. Yeah. Rather than controlling others. Finally, he says, all of you be like-minded, have unity of mind, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate, be humble. What are those? Every one of those, they're actions, words, and attitudes that build others rather than control others. In Jesus, we have everything. Our status right now is we are heirs with Jesus to the throne of the universe. Let's think for a minute of some of the tools that we tend to use when things don't go our way. Anger. And its passive-aggressive cousins, pouting, pulling out, pulling away, quiet quitting. What are those? Those are all tools we are using to control others. Even a concept that can be a useful tool in a difficult relationship, this idea of boundaries, setting boundaries, it's been amazing. It's a useful tool. But it's been amazing to me how long it took for people to recognize that it's too easy to use the idea of boundaries to simply control others, manipulate others, just to be more self-centered. I sometimes observed that some of the people who took the boundaries course were the people who had the tightest boundaries already. Right? Let's review these building behaviors briefly in that light. Like-minded, he said, which talks about being united in spirit. This is the one that drives them all. I love the way one commentator puts it. This is not a call for uniformity of opinion. It's a call for unity of disposition. Disagreement often leads to that relational condition that we sometimes call hardening of the categories. Stubbornly holding my ground, The first question I need to ask when differences start to cause friction is my heart still soft to that person? Be like-minded. In graduate school, I had the privilege of having as a personal mentor a man who had just been appointed as the head of the theology department for the school, and his office was right across the street from my apartment. Now, if there's any department in a graduate school of theology where people can tend toward hardening of the categories, it's the theology department. And although it was a surprise to some when this man was appointed the chair, I thought it was a brilliant move because he was the most harmonious of them all. On several occasions on Monday mornings, he would see me leave my apartment and he would call out the window and he'd say, "Mel, do you have a few minutes to stop by and pray with me?" I knew what it was about. They had their monthly department meetings on Monday at noon. And it was sometimes a challenge to keep everyone moving in the same direction. And one day as we prayed, he asked me to help him with his attitude to one specific person. He didn't name the name, but when he mentioned that he wanted me to pray about how to handle one person graciously and yet firmly so that he didn't control the whole meeting, I knew exactly who he was talking about. I'll never forget what he said. He said, "I wish I could be as sure about one thing as he is about everything." Hardening of the categories. And he asked me to pray that he would be able to work out of a spirit of harmony, of like-mindedness. I love that man. Sympathy. Being able and focused on entering the feelings and seeing the perspective of the other person. Love. Literally, that word is loving as brothers. An unbreakable family bond in spite of tension sometimes. A tender heart, not a hard heart. Humble, placing myself under. You know, we easily get distracted by whatever issue is in our face, don't we? And we form opinions, and then we form camps. We too quickly fall into these agree-disagree categories. And so the very first thing Peter challenged us toward is to ask ourselves, what does the way I relate to people say about living with the end in mind? About letting hope pull me forward? Am I a builder or a controller in my relationships? Have you asked yourself that question lately? How does your spouse see you? A builder or a controller? How does your work team see you? How do your neighbors experience you? Coming out of that is another question. It's still all about relationships, but he expands on it. Let's read verses 9 to 12 again. "Do not repay evil with evil or insult with evil or with insult, but on the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing." Let's stop there. It's so easy when we experience the exile factor to focus on what we have lost or what we might lose or feel we will never get, and becomes all about this is not fair. So what do? Tit for tat. We repay evil for evil. That's how people with an exile complex can easily start living. But that's not how chosen exiles get to live. That's living our hurt story. When we focus on what we've lost, what we're afraid to lose, what we can't have, there's a word that keeps cropping up, right? I don't deserve this. Or when we give back what was given to us, we say, she deserved that. No, when we let hope pull us forward to live with the end in mind, we'll have a totally different orientation. Do not return evil for evil, insult for insult, but instead bless others, because in your calling, you have inherited a blessing. And Peter quotes Psalm 34 to show that this has always been the way God's people have been called to live. What's the living with the end in mind question? Am I measuring not what I don't have or need to have, not what I've lost or might lose, but am I measuring on what I get to give away? That's what blessing is. using what you do have for the gain of others. Why is that so important? Because at the end of the day, God will not be measuring us by what and how much we got. God's going to be measuring us by what and how we gave away. In the end, I am either blessing my environment or I am bleeding from my environment, making sure I get all I can for myself. Even when we say we are serving people, if things stop going our way, or if we're not getting the attention we think we deserve, it's I quit, right? I'm not focusing on blessing others. I'm using blessing others as a way to bleed my environment for my own self-gratification. At the end of every day, one of the questions I should ask myself is, did I use what I have to bless others, or was I way too focused on what I didn't have yet? How it didn't go my way. Did I use my tongue to bless others or to put them down and elevate myself? Are you living with the end in mind? What is God calling you to give and let go of and not hang on to? Now that's a good Christmas question, right? We celebrate at Christmas the one who did not hang on to his status and stepped down and kept stepping down further and further, dying a criminal's death, who gave it all away so that we could have hope. Giving as God gave is God's plan for all of us in participating in his work with the money we've earned. It's why we're called to give off the top as first priority, not the leftovers. It's the way we're participating in the mission of God to bless everyone by drawing them into the sphere of his love and goodness. In the way you give, are you living with the end in mind? Number 3, as we're going to be spending most of the rest of our time this morning, are people asking me for my hope story? Or do people sense from me that I need them to validate my hurt story? My lost story. Let me read again our core text, verse 13. Who is going to harm you if you are eager, if you are zealous about, if you're committed to doing good, to do what benefits others? As a general rule, no one. Chances are you're going to be affirmed for doing what's good. Now, stop right there. You got to notice, it doesn't say who's going to harm you for doing what's right. It says for doing what's good. Good goes beyond right. It's important for 2 reasons, because this isn't just about following all the rules. It's about going beyond the rules to do what's good, what is the most beneficial, building and blessing people in a situation. It's important for another reason, because of how we tend to understand right. When we focus on what is right, we tend to think about what we think is fair. Isn't that true? No. The issue on what is good for others. When we do that, generally we'll be affirmed, blessed by people. Verse 14. But, even if you should suffer for doing what's right, you're blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have. You see, in general terms, we do good and we're blessed, affirmed. But everyone can do that. What happens when we're not affirmed for it? Or even put down or marginalized for it? It's the way we react in that situation that will reveal whether we're living our hurt story or fear of being hurt. When we say things like, I'm not getting involved, I'm just quiet quitting. When we are treated unjustly, unfairly, and we still do what is good for others, that's when our hope story becomes visible. And eventually someone will say to us, probably not in public, but in private, they'll say, you know, I just want you to know I saw what happened, and I admire that. I couldn't have done that. How can you do that? Why would you do that? I've seen you live that way with constant criticism, picking on you, and yet it doesn't seem to affect the way you treat people. As a matter of fact, you just seem to keep us all together. How can you do that? Can you see why I'm saying this verse is not about a philosophical, argumentative apologetics? No, it's about the apologetics of a hope-filled life, living from a story of hope, not a story of hurt or fear. And what's our cop-out answer in a situation like that? We say, well, I just feel like I can't do anything about it anyway, so I just have to live with it. That's not a hope story answer. That's a hurt story answer, right? A victim answer. What about something like this? You know, one of the things I've learned to do is realize that while those issues are important, they're not really ultimately important. Okay, tell me more. Or even something like, you know, I'm not sure taking it on would really benefit the whole team. Those kinds of answers will beg for further discussion about the hope that is in you, what your real hope story is. You can only let go of the hurt in your hurt story when instead of thinking about it as something to endure, just hang in there, you look at it as an opportunity to show the hope that is in you. This is so important. We're going to take some time to focus on what knowing my hope story means and how my hope story actually gets deeper and fuller and richer over time as I'm living it well. So let's talk about the big hope story, God's story, the way God writes our story, history and humanity, basically 4 parts, right? You can divide some of these parts up into 2 parts or whatever, but 4 parts. Creation, the fall, God's plan for redeeming us in spite of the fall, and ultimate restoration. And sometimes we could talk about the transformation part leading to restoration. That's God's version of our story as humanity. What He has done and what He is doing to make it a story of hope. But every single one of us has our own version of our story with each of these factors. And the question is, have I embraced my hope story in Jesus? If we have allowed Jesus to choose us, to buy and own us through recognizing what He did on the cross, as life happens in our exile existence, our hope story, including all of these phases, can become richer and deeper and more real, or we can move back into a self-made, self-centered story. We have the choice. It's really helpful to rethink through this little exercise regularly, so let's do that. What's your creation story? And by creation story, the question is, who or what shaped you into the person you are today? What was it? What is it that most shape who you thought you were, who you think you are? Who do I give credit for who I am and what I am and have achieved? For some of us, it's like me, right? For me, some of my creation story involves being the oldest in a family of 6 kids that homesteaded in northern BC, and my identity was largely framed by 2 things. Number 1, I was an outsider. I did not feel included. Everybody in my church was related to each other, and on Sunday they had dinner together, and I had nobody. As the oldest of 6 in an environment where my dad worked long hours and my mom, by necessity, had to give the most attention to the youngest, I worked too, but mostly to get attention. Another part of my creation story is I was created as the skinniest guy in town by a long shot. We won't get into all the details of that, but as a result of those 2, I was driven to prove myself by performing. I got my validation through good marks, although I didn't work for them and didn't hate it. I hated studying. And mostly through my athletic endeavors. I couldn't win a fight with a rag doll, but I could run faster than anybody else and outperform anyone in any sport other than hockey. I was still in the top third being picked every time we played on the outdoor rink, but I couldn't be the best. So hockey was not my game. Those are just a few pieces of my creation story. And as I've grown and become an adult, I've seen more and more different kinds of things that were part of how I developed my identity and who I was. Everybody has a fall story. Sometimes a point of awareness, and sometimes our fall story, the older we get, the more we recognize, oh my goodness, I've never thought about that. That's also part of my fall story. Where we realize that things were broken, and not just out there, but in here. The question is, what parts of my life are not what they were designed to be? Health, relationships, self-image, and how am I coming to terms with the broken factors, the gap factors? Am I even recognizing them? For me, one of those points came in 6th grade where I tried to get the attention of a girl I was sweet on in a way that she didn't think was very sweet. And she turned around and looked at me and he says, "Why can't you be nice like your dad?" It came at other points when I realized that a lot of my behaviors, although I never really did bad things, they weren't really good either. They were attention-getting. And I realized there was this gap, not just in what I thought I wanted and needed from life, but a gap between what I was doing and what I really wanted to do and should be doing. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 7, right? And by the way, let's talk about what Paul says in Romans chapter 3. We read it earlier in our introduction. About what we call sin. Romans 3, verse 23. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You know, we tend to think sin is doing bad things. Well, there is a word for sin that focused on that, because it's where it tends to lead. It's called iniquity. But the most common word for sin in the Bible is simply about falling short, missing the mark. It's not necessarily always intentional. It's not always bad. The way I like to put it is that none of us, if we're honest with ourselves, can even live up to our own standards, let alone God's standards. If we're honest with ourselves, we all have a fall story, a gap. What's your fall story? Where have you come to the point of realizing, it's not working? And who are you blaming? Figuring out honestly that life is not working and realizing it's not all everyone else's fault. It's not all the system's fault. It's not the world's fault. We all have that story. And everyone has their own redemption story. At least how they try to overcome our fall story. That redemption story most often has to do with things like trying harder. For some of us, just giving in and going with the flow. Some of us, it's just forget it all. If there's a God, He can accept me for who I am. For me, my redemption story began when I prayed the prayer asking Jesus into my heart when I was 5 years old. I recognized the gap fairly early in my life, but in some ways that made life more difficult for me because I still thought, and I caught in my environment, that my redemption came from trying harder. I grew up with this real sense of shouldiness. And I actually, in many ways, became frozen by my shouldiness, and comparing and competing was where I lived. And I dealt with my shouldiness by just not taking on what I felt I couldn't win at and blowing off the rest. I didn't study at school because I was afraid that if I studied and didn't get the top mark, I was a loser. So I just didn't study. I just won't compete. I actually got my validation for being the smartest guy who never studied. I got the highest marks of those who never showed up in class. I became fearful that I'd never really make it, so I pretended I didn't care. I didn't care about my grades, so I didn't have to study to try to compete. I gave myself to athletics because there I could win. For me, the crucial point came after I graduated from high school and I'd been given an opportunity to play basketball at a university level, and I froze. I didn't take it because I knew I wouldn't be the best. And I knew I didn't really have my act together in a way that I could live a truly different hope story outside of my protected environment. Although in one sense my redemption story began early, it was as a young adult that I began to become my true hope story as I started engaging seriously the power and the beauty and the relevance and the rightness and the truth of the Bible as my story. I still remember the point when I identified with Jeremiah the prophet where he says, your words were found and I ate them and they became the joy and rejoicing of my heart. When I realized that Jesus affirmed me apart from my performance, that Jesus had taken my failures on himself and given me everything that is his. And as the Lord of the universe, he walked with me, and that gradually began to sink in at an adult level. Everyone also wants a restoration story. A story that begins not only with ultimate restoration, but with transformation in my heart. For me, one of the things that God gave me was a desire to do and live for others, not myself. And another thing that happened is that God gave me the courage to set a higher standard in my own work environment. And as a student, I had a lot of work environment experiences that gave me the opportunity to set a higher standard of honesty, of elevating others, of going the extra mile, not just doing my job, but others' jobs, and of including the people on the outside of the circle. For me, one of the most meaningful compliments I ever received was as a 21-year-old working on a team that was building steel structures for sawmills for a very cynical boss who had grown up in the church but had thrown it all overboard, who I knew was scrutinizing very carefully what I did. He knew I was considering a job as a youth pastor, but kept me on as long as he could. And when I told him I was quitting to do what I thought I was supposed to do, he said, well, just so you know, if that doesn't work out for you, please call me first, because I will always have a job for you, and next time it's going to be a leadership job. That was one of the beginning pieces of my transformation story. And those who give themselves to live in this story have an inheritance in that great hope story of a day when everything will be restored. Have you thought through your hope story? Let's ask several questions. Do you really honestly have this kind of hope story? Have you ever, well, as Peter says, set apart Christ as Lord in your heart? Have you said to him, I accept what you did for me to bring me to God, and I will make you in charge of my life? And I invite you to make me into the kind of person you want me to be. Realizing that to make you the kind of person he wants you to be, he will send you into an environment where you're not affirmed or doing what's good. Test you, give you the opportunity. Have you ever done that? Are you continuing to grow in your hope story? Am I growing in the calm confidence of God's affirmation and the fullness of hope I have in him? Or am I living in fear and being prone to being, well, agitated? Verse 14, do not fear what they fear, nor be troubled. Literally, that word means shaken up, agitated, inner turmoil. Am I constantly agitated inside about something? Am I constantly an agitator in my environment? We even justify it, saying, well, that's my role. No, it's not. Not if you're living in your hope story. Do any of these hope story stages that we talk about resonate with you? And are you growing into them, growing deeper into them? Has anyone ever asked you for your hope story? Are they even seeing it? Or are you still living your hurt story, your fear story? Final thing Peter speaks to is the question that we all have. So how can I do that? How can I respond with hope and love when all I seem to see is the exile factors? How everything is against me, not fair to me. That's where Peter takes us at the end of this passage. He's told us what we should do and what we can do because of our hope. We can live in love for others and blessing others. Hope and love. As you see those two together, something coming to your mind? There are two aspects of that great trilogy, right? The great three-legged stool in our hope story. What are the big three? Hope, love, and what's always first and foundational? Faith. Not faith in the sense of hoping against hope. Believing something in spite of the evidence. That's not biblical faith. Biblical faith is trusting in something because of the evidence. And what is the evidence when it comes to the injustices of life? Well, Peter rehearses it, our real hope story, verse 17. For it is better, if God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil, because Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in this body, but made alive in the Spirit. What is this telling us about how I can live in that story well? Well, the only answer to that question is another story, and that is, which story am I allowing my mind to dwell on? I so easily get drawn into focusing on my hurt story. It's not fair. It's not what I deserve. It's unjust. But to live well as a sojourner is to dwell, get this is beautiful, dwell on the beauty, the power, and the true injustice at the heart of your hope story. You see, at the heart of your injustice story is another injustice that reverses all injustice for you. Jesus, the sinless one, the righteous one, the judge of all the earth, the Lord to whom we are called to submit, took on himself the unjust consequences or the just consequences of my unjust behaviors and attitudes. He, as in 2 verse 24, he bore our sins in his own body on the tree and imputed to me, granted me the status of his righteousness to deliver me to God. To guarantee that in the end I will stand before God dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless, standing before the throne, as the hymn writer puts it. You see, the injustice I feel in this exile existence can actually serve to deepen my faith and strengthen my hope and inspire me to keep loving and serving and giving when I allow myself to dwell on that injustice at the heart of my hope story. Jesus, the just one, took all injustice on himself. I won't be there in the end because I deserve it, because I deserve something better than I have now. I will be there because the one who does deserve it chose to take on my hurt story so that he could transform it into a hope story. Is that the story you're dwelling on? You're thinking about? Now let's just glance at what is possibly, and I think is the most confusing and difficult to understand passage in the entire New Testament. Okay, verse 19 to 22. After being made alive, he went and made proclamations to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. What in the world does that mean? Most commentators take a stab at trying to figure it out, but in the end, even the best thinkers admit they're not really sure. Okay? This is one of those passages that, well, in the end, we have to go with Mark Twain's observation. It ain't those parts of the Bible I can't understand that bother me, it's the parts I do understand. It's been helpful to me to look at it this way. Peter is using Noah's story and Jesus' story together to illustrate what? That regardless of what's against you in this life, God always wins. God's story wins. Noah built his ark. His declaration that he believed God's declaration of judgment on a world that abandoned him, and he trusted God's word of hope, and he declared that. He spent a whole chunk of life just building the ark, trusting the story that people mocked him for believing, but it happened. But it wasn't really the ark that saved him. It was God that saved him because he trusted in the hope story. He compares it to baptism, saying it's not that baptism does anything to you. Baptism is a declaration. You have put your trust in the only hope story, that you have accepted that Jesus died for you to bring you to God. And by the way, if you'd like to get baptized to declare that you're in and that's your story, we're going to have another baptism service on January 14th, mid-January. Talk to us about that. And he made that hope real by rising again and leaving as he said he would. And he is where? Verse 22. He's gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. All so that I can rest secure and safe in the only story of hope.